The afternoon sun hung low over London, casting long golden shadows across the wide plaza in front of Buckingham Palace. Tourists milled about, some snapping photos, others craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the famous changing of the guard. Children giggled as they tried to mimic the stiff, slow march of the soldiers in red tunics and tall black bearskin hats. The air buzzed with the usual mix of excitement and calm that comes with a perfect spring day in the city. Among the guards standing perfectly still along the palace gates was a young soldier. He'd been on duty for nearly 2 hours already, boots planted firmly on the stone, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed straight ahead. His uniform was spotless, every brass button polished to a shine, his bearskin hat sitting just so.
He didn't flinch when a pigeon landed near his boot.
He didn't smile when a little girl waved at him shyly. He didn't even blink when a gust of wind tugged at the heavy fabric of his coat. This was his job, his honor, and he took it seriously. Every second of stillness was a promise. I am here. I am steady. I protect what matters. He'd trained for years to earn this post. He'd marched in rain, snow, and blistering heat. He'd studied protocol until it was second nature. And he'd done it all with quiet pride, knowing he represented not just himself but centuries of tradition, discipline, and service. He didn't wear the uniform for attention. He wore it because it meant something. A block away, the rumble of motorcycle engines cut through the peaceful hum of the square. Heads turned as a group of bikes rolled in, loud gleaming machines with chrome pipes and black leather seats. The riders wore matching vests covered in patches, some with skulls, others with slogans that made nearby parents quickly pull their kids closer. They parked haphazardly near the curb, kicking stands down with a clatter. There were about 6 of them, all men, all wearing sunglasses despite the mild light, their voices rough and loud as they laughed and shoved each other like they owned the place. One of them, the tallest, with a shaved head and a thick silver ring through his eyebrow, stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. He'd been drinking. You could smell it from 10 feet away. He swaggered toward the line of guards like he was walking into a bar he'd just decided to take over. Most people kept their distance from the silent soldiers, respecting the invisible line between spectator and ceremony. But this man didn't care about lines. He stopped right in front of the young guard, the one who hadn't moved a muscle since the ceremony began. For a long moment he just stared, arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. Then he let out a sharp laugh. "Look at this one," he said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, dressed up like a toy soldier. "Bet he don't even know what real duty looks like." A few of his friends chuckled behind him, egging him on. The crowd around them grew tense. Some people backed away. Others pulled out their phones, sensing something bad was about to happen. The guard didn't react. Not a twitch. Not a glance. His eyes stayed locked on the horizon, just as he'd been taught. Responding, even with anger, would break protocol. And breaking protocol wasn't just about discipline. It was about respect for the office he served, for the institution behind him, for the people who'd worn this uniform before him and would after. But the biker didn't like being ignored. "Hey," he barked, stepping closer. "I'm talking to you, pal. Still nothing." The guard remained a statue. That's when the insults started. Ugly words laced with hate meant to provoke, to humiliate. The kind of language that makes your stomach tighten just hearing it. He called the guard names that had nothing to do with his role and everything to do with the color of his skin. A few people in the crowd gasped. A woman covered her child's ears. An older man stepped forward as if to say something, but one of the other bikers blocked his path with a glare. The tension thickened like fog. You could feel it pressing down on the square, the kind of silence that comes right before something breaks. Then, without warning, the biker shoved the guard hard in the chest. The crowd let out a collective gasp. The guard staggered slightly, just an inch, but caught himself instantly, returning to perfect posture. His face gave nothing away. No anger, no fear, just resolve. That seemed to enrage the biker even more. Being ignored was one thing, but being shoved and still not getting a reaction? That was unbearable to someone who needed to feel powerful. "Stand up straight." "Boy," he sneered, voice dripping with contempt. And then, he did it. In one quick, brutal motion. He swung his hand and slapped the guard across the face. The sound cracked through the air like a gunshot. People screamed. Someone shouted, "No." A phone camera kept rolling. The guard's head snapped to the side from the force, but just as quickly he brought it back. His jaw tightened. His eyes stayed forward. He didn't raise a hand. Didn't say a word. Didn't even breathe heavily. He just stood there, wounded but unbroken, the red mark already rising on his cheek. Up in the palace, behind a tall window on the second floor, Queen Elizabeth II watched it all unfold. She'd been in her private sitting room, reviewing letters and preparing for a small reception later that evening. She often paused to look out over the grounds, especially during the changing of the guard. It was one of the few moments of public ceremony she still enjoyed from a distance. She'd seen the bikers arrive. She'd seen the tension build. And she'd seen the slap. Her expression didn't change. The Queen was known for her composure, for her ability to remain unreadable in even the most trying moments. But those who knew her well would have noticed the slight narrowing of her eyes, the way her fingers pressed a little harder against the arm of her chair. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She simply turned to her private secretary, who had entered quietly moments before, also drawn by the commotion outside. "See that it is handled," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Properly, that was all." Down below, chaos began to swirl. Palace security moved in swiftly, forming a human barrier between the bikers and the guards. Police officers, who had been stationed nearby as always, rushed over. The biker who'd thrown the slap was already being surrounded by his friends, laughing like it was all a joke, like he'd just pulled off some clever prank. But the mood in the square had shifted. People weren't laughing. They were angry, disgusted. Some shouted at the bikers. Others gathered around the guard, offering quiet words of support, though he still couldn't acknowledge them. One elderly woman reached out as if to touch his arm, then stopped herself, remembering the rules. A young officer approached the guard gently. "Are you all right, sir?" he asked softly. The guard gave the tiniest nod, just enough to say yes, but not enough to break his stance. Inside the palace, orders were already moving through quiet channels. Footage from the security cameras was being saved. Names were being checked. Calls were being made, and high above it all, the Queen remained at her window for a few moments longer, watching as the young soldier stood tall despite the sting on his face and the weight of what had just happened. She knew what that kind of restraint cost. She'd seen it before, in wartime, in crisis, in the quiet moments when dignity mattered more than pride. She turned away at last, her mind already working through what must be done next. Not for spectacle, not for headlines, but because some lines once crossed demanded more than silence. The sun dipped lower. The crowd slowly dispersed, buzzing with what they'd witnessed. The guard remained at his post until the ceremony ended, his face calm, his posture unwavering, and no one, not the bikers, not the tourists, not even the guard himself, knew that the Queen had seen it all. By the time the changing of the guard ended, the video was already spreading like wildfire. Someone in the crowd had hit record the moment the shouting started, and within minutes the clip was posted online. At first it was just shared among friends. "You won't believe what happened outside the palace today." But then a news outlet picked it up, then another, and soon it was everywhere. People watched it over and over, each time feeling that same jolt of shock when the slap landed. The silence of the guard afterward made it even harder to watch. It wasn't just an attack on a person. It felt like an attack on something deeper. Respect. Order. The idea that some things should be honored, not mocked. Back at the barracks, the young guard finally removed his bearskin hat and let out a long breath. His cheek still burned. A medic gently cleaned the red mark and applied a cool compress, but said there was no real damage, just bruising. What hurt more was the memory of those words, the way they'd been thrown like stones. He didn't talk much. He never had. But his fellow soldiers didn't need him to speak. They saw the tightness in his shoulders, the way he kept his eyes down as he changed out of his uniform. One of the older sergeants clapped him on the back and said, "You did your duty. Better than most would have. That was enough." Meanwhile, inside Buckingham Palace, things moved quickly but quietly. The Queen had returned to her private study, where her private secretary stood waiting with a folder. It contained the guard's full-service record. She read it carefully, her reading glasses perched low on her nose. 2 tours overseas, multiple commendations. A letter from a commanding officer praising his unshakable discipline under fire. She paused at one line. He once held his position for 12 hours under enemy fire without food or water, never once complaining. She closed the folder slowly and set it aside. Has he been spoken to? She asked. He's been debriefed by security, Your Majesty. He declined to make a formal complaint, citing protocol. She nodded. That didn't surprise her. Men like him didn't seek attention. They served because they believed in it. Upstairs in the communications office, palace staff were fielding calls from newsrooms around the world. Reporters wanted a statement. Social media was exploding with outrage, but also with support. Thousands posting messages like "Stand tall, soldier" and "They slapped the crown today." Yet the palace remained silent. No press release. No comment. To outsiders it might have seemed cold, but those who understood the monarchy knew better. Silence wasn't indifference. Sometimes it was the first step before something far more meaningful. The police, meanwhile, were already tracking down the bikers. Their vests made them easy to identify. Within hours, officers located their clubhouse on the outskirts of the city, a rundown warehouse with a rusted sign and oil stains on the concrete. 2 of the men were found drinking beer in the parking lot, still laughing about that stiff-backed soldier. They were arrested without resistance. The leader, the one who'd thrown the slap, wasn't there. But his motorcycle was, and his phone, left on a table inside, contained texts bragging about putting that palace puppet in his place. That was all the evidence the police needed. Back in the city, the guard sat alone in the mess hall stirring a cup of tea. He wasn't really drinking. He kept replaying the moment in his head, not the slap, but the faces in the crowd. The woman who looked like she wanted to cry. The boy who'd pointed and said, "Why'd he do that, Mom?" He wondered if that boy would remember this day for the rest of his life. And if so, what would he remember? The hate or the stillness? He didn't know it yet, but his stillness had already become a kind of shield. For others, for the institution, even for the country. People were sharing his image online, not as a victim, but as a symbol. A teacher in Manchester showed the video in class and asked her students, "What does courage look like when you can't fight back?" A veteran in Glasgow wrote a letter to the local paper saying, "I've seen men break under less." This one didn't flinch. That evening, as London's lights began to glow, the Queen made a quiet request. She asked to meet the guard, not in a grand reception room, not with cameras or fanfare, but in a small sitting room off the palace gardens, where the only witnesses would be the roses blooming outside the window. The guard was told only that, "Her Majesty wishes to speak with you." He assumed it was about protocol, maybe a reprimand for drawing attention, though he hadn't done anything wrong. He polished his boots again, pressed his uniform, and walked through the palace halls with his heart pounding harder than it had during the slap. When he entered the room, the Queen was standing by the window, hands folded. She turned as he came in and gave a small, warm smile. "You stood your ground today," she said simply. Not many would have. He didn't know what to say. He'd rehearsed formal replies in his head, but none felt right. So he just said, "It's my duty, ma'am." She nodded as if she'd expected nothing less. Then she walked to a small desk and picked up an envelope. She handed it to him. It wasn't official palace stationery. It was plain cream-colored paper sealed with a simple wax stamp. "This is from me," she said. "Not as your queen, just as someone who saw what you did and what it meant." He took it carefully as if it might dissolve in his hands. "You don't have to read it now," she added gently. "But know this, what happened today wasn't just about you. It was about who we are and who we choose to be when tested." He left the room a few minutes later, the envelope tucked inside his tunic, close to his heart. Outside, the night air was cool and quiet. For the first time since the slap, he felt something other than tension. He felt seen. Back inside, the Queen returned to her window. She didn't watch the guards this time. She watched the city, the lights, the movement, the millions of lives unfolding beyond the palace walls. She knew the video would keep circulating. She knew the trial would come. She knew the country would debate, argue, maybe even divide over what it all meant. But she also knew this. Sometimes the quietest moments speak the loudest. And today, a young man in a red coat had said more with his silence than most ever could with words. By morning, the story had gone global. News channels in New York, Tokyo, Nairobi, all showing the same clip, all asking the same question. What do we do when hate meets honor? And though no one knew it yet, the Queen's private meeting would leak. Not through palace gossip, but through a single trusted source who told a reporter she saw it all. And she acted. That was enough to shift the tone of the coverage. It wasn't just about racism or violence anymore. It was about dignity, about leadership that doesn't shout but sees and responds. The guard, for his part, still hadn't opened the letter. He kept it on his bedside table next to his medal from overseas. He'd open it when he was ready. Not for the world to see, just for himself, because what mattered wasn't the slap. It was what came after. And for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful that what came after might actually be good. The arrests happened fast. So fast that by the next morning, the leader of the biker group was already sitting in a holding cell, still wearing the same leather vest from the day before, now stained with coffee and smelling of stale sweat. He hadn't expected this. In his mind, it had just been a bit of rough fun, showing off for his mates, putting that stuck-up palace boy in his place. He figured at worst he'd get a fine, maybe a warning, but the moment the police read him his rights, something in his gut twisted. This wasn't going away. News vans lined the street outside the police station. Reporters shouted questions through the barred windows, but he kept his head down, suddenly very aware that the world was watching. His phone had been seized, and with it every careless message, every boastful comment he'd typed while drunk. One text in particular: "Slap that royal puppet right in front of the Queen's house. Bet she's fuming," was now being quoted in headlines across the country. Inside the station, detectives worked through the night. Witnesses came forward, tourists, locals, even a street performer who'd been playing violin nearby. Everyone remembered the same things: the shouting, the racial slurs, the way the guard never moved, not even when struck. The video, already viewed millions of times, showed it all in brutal clarity. There was no room for he said, she said. The truth was right there, frozen in pixels and sound. Meanwhile, back at the barracks, the young guard was given the day off, a rare thing. But he didn't sleep in. He rose at dawn, made his bed with hospital corners, and sat by the window with a cup of tea. He finally opened the letter from the Queen. It wasn't long, just a few paragraphs, but every word felt weighed and chosen with care. She thanked him not just for his service, but for his restraint. "In a world that often rewards noise," she wrote, "your silence spoke with rare courage." He read it 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it back in its envelope. He didn't show it to anyone. It wasn't meant for show. It was meant for him. That same morning, something unexpected happened. A group of veterans, men and women who'd served in Iraq, Afghanistan, even the Falklands, gathered outside the palace gates. They weren't there to protest. They were there to stand in solidarity. Dressed in civilian clothes but wearing their old regimental pins, they formed a quiet line near where the incident had occurred. One held a sign that simply read, "We see you." Tourists stopped to take photos, but the veterans didn't pose. They just stood, still as the guards they once were, honoring the same values. The guard heard about it from a friend who'd passed by on his way to duty. "They're there for you," his friend said quietly. The guard didn't know what to say. He'd never asked for this, but he understood it. It wasn't about him. It was about what he represented: discipline, respect, the idea that some lines shouldn't be crossed no matter who you are. Back in the legal world, things moved with unusual speed. Normally, cases like this could drag on for months, but this one had the Crown's quiet attention. The prosecutor assigned to the case was known for handling sensitive matters with precision. She reviewed the evidence, spoke with the guard, who gave a calm, factual statement, and consulted with senior officials. Within days, formal charges were filed: assault, racially aggravated public order offense, and threatening behavior toward a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces. The last charge was rare, but not unheard of. Attacking a royal guard wasn't just attacking a person. It was seen as an affront to the Crown itself. The biker's lawyer tried to downplay it. "My client was intoxicated," he told reporters. "He regrets his actions. It wasn't about race, it was about frustration with authority." But the video told a different story, and the text told an even clearer one. Public opinion had already turned hard against him. Even some of his own biker friends started speaking out. One former member of the group gave an interview saying, "We ride for freedom, not hate. What he did? That's not us." The guard, for his part, avoided the news. He didn't read the articles. He didn't watch the debates on television. He went back to duty 2 days later, standing once more in his red tunic and bearskin hat. Face calm, posture perfect. Some tourists recognized him. A few tried to take selfies with him, but he remained still as always. Others just stood quietly and watched as if paying silent respects. One afternoon, a little girl, no older than 6, walked up to him with her mother. She held out a small drawing, a stick figure in a red coat standing tall with the sun shining above and the words, "You are brave," written in wobbly letters. The guard couldn't take it, of course, protocol. But the mother gently placed it at his feet before walking away. He didn't look down until his shift ended. When he did, he picked it up carefully and tucked it into his pocket, right next to the Queen's letter. Inside the palace, preparations were underway for something unprecedented. The Queen had decided to invite the guard to a private audience, not just a quick handshake, but a proper meeting in one of the smaller, more personal rooms. No press, no photographers, just the two of them and perhaps a cup of tea. Palace staff worked quietly to arrange it, making sure the timing wouldn't draw attention. They knew the world would talk if they found out, but they also knew the Queen didn't do things for show. She did them because they were right. The day of the meeting arrived. The guard was nervous, not because he feared the Queen, but because he didn't want to say the wrong thing. He'd rehearsed a dozen responses in his head, but in the end he decided to just be honest. When he entered the room, she was seated by a window, sunlight catching the silver in her hair. She rose as he came in, a small gesture, but one that meant everything. "You've had quite a week," she said with a gentle smile. He nodded. "Yes, ma'am," she gestured for him to sit. He did, perched on the edge of the chair, hands folded in his lap. "I wanted to thank you properly," she said. "Not just for your service, but for how you carried yourself when tested. That kind of strength doesn't come from training alone. It comes from character." He looked down for a moment, then met her eyes. "I just did what I was taught, ma'am." "And that," she said softly, "is exactly why it matters." They spoke for nearly 20 minutes about duty, about the weight of wearing the uniform, about the kind of world they both hoped to leave behind. She didn't ask for details about the attack. She didn't need to. She'd seen it. And she knew what it cost him to stand there and take it without striking back. Before he left, she handed him a small box. Inside was a simple pin, a silver lion, the symbol of the household division, but with a subtle engraving on the back. Steadfast. It wasn't an official medal. It was personal. Just for him. As he walked back through the palace corridors, the pin tucked safely in his pocket, he felt something shift inside him. Not pride, never that. But peace. He hadn't done what he did for thanks. But being seen, truly seen by someone who understood the weight of silence, that meant more than he could say. Outside, the city buzzed on. The trial date was set. The world kept turning. But in that quiet moment, something important had been restored. Not just for him, but for everyone who believed that dignity still mattered. And though no cameras captured it, no headlines announced it, those who knew the Queen best would later say this. That meeting was one of the most meaningful she'd had in years. Because sometimes, the strongest statements aren't made in speeches or laws, but in a quiet room over tea, between two people who understand what it means to stand tall when the world tries to knock you down. The courtroom was smaller than most people expected. Wood-paneled walls, high windows, rows of hard-backed benches that creaked when you shifted. It wasn't flashy. There were no cameras allowed inside, no dramatic music, no shouting crowds, just the quiet hum of tension and the weight of what was about to happen. The biker sat at the defendant's table, flanked by his lawyer. He wore a plain shirt now, no vest, no patches. His hands fidgeted under the table. He kept glancing toward the door as if hoping someone might walk in and fix everything, but no one came. His so-called friends had vanished the moment the headlines turned ugly. Even his lawyer looked tired, like he already knew how this would end. On the other side of the room, the young guard sat with his commanding officer. He wasn't there to testify, he'd already given his statement, but he wanted to be present. Not for revenge, not to gloat, but because he believed in seeing things through to the end. He wore his uniform not for show, but because it was who he was. Some people in the gallery turned to look at him when he entered. A few nodded. Others just watched in silence. The judge entered and the room stood. She was known for being fair but firm. the kind of person who didn't tolerate games. She took her seat, adjusted her glasses, and looked down at the file in front of her. "This is a serious matter," she began, her voice calm but carrying, not only because of the violence involved, but because of what it represents. The prosecutor stood first. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply played the video, the same one millions had seen online. But now, in the quiet of the courtroom, it felt heavier. You could hear the gasps from the crowd when the slurs were spoken. You could feel the collective flinch when the slap landed. Then she read the text from the biker's phone. Boastful, cruel, laced with hate. She called 2 witnesses, a tourist who'd been standing just feet away, and a police officer who'd reviewed the security footage from the palace. When it was the defense's turn, the lawyer tried to argue that his client had been drunk, that he didn't mean it, that it was just a moment of poor judgment. He claimed the racial comments were taken out of context, but the judge wasn't having it. "Context?" she said, raising an eyebrow. "He called a serving soldier a racial slur, shoved him and struck him in front of hundreds of people, including children. What context could possibly excuse that?" The lawyer sat down, defeated. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The guard was asked to speak, not as a witness but as the victim. He stood slowly, straightened his tunic, and faced the court. "I don't speak for myself," he said, his voice steady. "I speak for the uniform I wear. That day I was representing more than just my regiment. I was representing service, discipline, and respect for this country and its people. What happened wasn't just an attack on me. It was an attack on those values." He paused, then added quietly, "I didn't fight back because my duty is to protect, not to provoke." But that doesn't mean what he did was acceptable. He sat down. The room was silent for a long moment. Even the biker looked down, unable to meet anyone's eyes. A week later, the verdict came. Guilty on all counts. The judge didn't mince words in her sentencing remarks. "This was not a mistake," she said firmly. "This was a deliberate act of aggression fueled by prejudice. You chose to humiliate a man who was doing his duty, peacefully, honorably, and without provocation. In doing so, you disrespected not only him, but the institution he serves and the public trust that upholds it." The leader received a 30-month prison sentence. His 2 companions, who'd egged him on and blocked bystanders from intervening, got 18 months each. They'd serve their time, the judge said, and hopefully reflect on what it truly means to be a citizen of this country. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, but the guard didn't stop. He walked straight to a waiting car, his commanding officer beside him. He didn't give interviews. He didn't pose for photos. He just went home. But the story didn't end there. Within days, the motorcycle club that the men belonged to began to unravel. Former members posted statements online distancing themselves from the group's recent behavior. One longtime rider said in an interview, "We've always been about brotherhood and freedom on the open road, not hate. That's not what our patches stand for." Local businesses that had once welcomed the club started turning them away. Their clubhouse lease wasn't renewed. Within a month, the group disbanded quietly, its flags taken down, its bikes sold off. Back at the barracks, life slowly returned to normal, but not quite the same. The guard was promoted to sergeant, a recognition not just of his service but of his character under fire. His fellow soldiers treated him with even deeper respect, not because he'd been attacked but because of how he'd carried himself afterward. He never acted like a hero. He just did his job better than ever. One evening, he received an unexpected invitation. A youth center in East London asked if he'd be willing to speak at an event about respect, discipline, and standing up to racism, not with fists, but with courage. He almost said no. He wasn't a speaker. He wasn't comfortable in front of crowds. But then he thought about that little girl's drawing, the veterans who'd stood outside the palace, the quiet nod from strangers on the street. Maybe his story could help someone else. So he went. The room was full of teenagers, some curious, some skeptical, a few looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. He didn't give a lecture. He just told them what happened in plain words. He talked about fear, about wanting to hit back, about choosing not to. He told them that real strength isn't about winning a fight. It's about knowing when not to start one. And that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand still when the world tries to knock you down. Afterward, a boy raised his hand. "Did it hurt?" he asked. Yes, the guard said honestly. Not just the slap. The words hurt more. Then why didn't you walk away? Because walking away would have meant letting hate win, he said. And I couldn't do that. Not for me and not for the people who came before me who fought so I could stand there in the first place. The room was quiet for a moment. Then one by one the kids started clapping. Not wildly, just steadily, respectfully. And for the first time, the guard felt like maybe something good could come from all of it. Meanwhile, inside Buckingham Palace, the Queen kept the small silver pin she'd given him in her mind. She didn't speak publicly about the trial. She didn't need to. Her actions had already spoken volumes, but in private, she told her staff, "That young man reminded us all what service truly means." And though the headlines would fade and the news cycle would move on, something had shifted. People talked differently about respect. Schools used the incident in lessons about citizenship. Veterans groups launched new programs to mentor young people about honor and restraint. The slap had been meant to humiliate. Instead, it became a mirror, showing the ugliness of hate but also the quiet power of dignity. And in the end, it wasn't the biker who was remembered. It was the guard who stood tall, the judge who spoke truth, and the countless ordinary people who chose to stand on the side of decency. Because sometimes justice isn't just about punishment, it's about healing. And that healing had already begun, one quiet act of courage at a time. Months passed. The leaves turned gold, then fell. Winter came and went. The city moved on, as cities do. New headlines, new worries, new stories to tell. But for some, the memory of that spring afternoon outside Buckingham Palace never really faded. It lingered like a quiet echo, not loud but steady. The young guard, now a sergeant, returned to his duties with the same calm focus as before. If anything, he stood a little straighter, not out of pride but out of quiet certainty. He'd been tested and he hadn't broken. That knowledge settled in his bones like something solid, something he could lean on. He still didn't seek attention. He still didn't give interviews. But when children pointed at him during the changing of the guard and whispered, "That's him," he didn't look away. He just held his gaze steady, offering them without words a kind of silent promise. You can be strong without being cruel. You can stand your ground without raising your voice. One morning he received new orders. He was being assigned to the Queen's personal guard detail, a rare honor usually reserved for those with years of exemplary service. It wasn't announced with fanfare. There was no ceremony, just a quiet nod from his commanding officer and a new schedule on his desk. But he knew what it meant. It wasn't just about skill or experience. It was about trust. He took his first shift inside the palace grounds a week later. The pace was different, quieter, more deliberate. He walked the inner courtyards, stood watch near private entrances, moved with the kind of calm precision that came from years of discipline. And sometimes, through a window or across a garden path, he'd catch a glimpse of the Queen. She never acknowledged him in front of others, never made a show of it. But once, as he stood near the rose garden, she paused on her walk, gave him the faintest nod, and said softly, "Good morning." That was all, but it was enough. Inside classrooms across the country, the story of that day became part of something bigger. Teachers used it not to shame, but to teach. About respect, about the weight of words, about how courage isn't always loud. In one school in Birmingham, students wrote letters to serving soldiers thanking them for their restraint and strength. In another, a drama class reenacted the scene, not to dramatize the violence, but to explore the guard's choice to remain still. "What would you have done?" the teacher asked. The discussions that followed were honest, sometimes messy, but always thoughtful. Even the police began using the incident in training, showing new recruits the video not just as evidence, but as a lesson in de-escalation, in how dignity can disarm hatred more effectively than force ever could. Sometimes, one instructor told his class, the most powerful thing you can do is nothing, when nothing means holding your ground with grace. Then came Christmas. As always, the Queen prepared her annual broadcast, a message to the nation and to the Commonwealth delivered from a quiet room in the palace, her voice familiar to generations. Millions tuned in, expecting the usual reflections on family, faith, and hope. But this year, something in her words felt different, deeper, more pointed, though never angry. She spoke of moments that test us, of the quiet strength found not in shouting, but in standing firm. She talked about how true character is revealed not when things are easy, but when they are hard and when no one is watching. And then, with the gentle firmness that had defined her reign, she said, "In a world that often rewards noise, let us not forget the power of stillness. Let us honor those who choose decency over division, restraint over rage, and service over self." She never named names. She didn't have to. Anyone who'd followed the story knew exactly what she meant. The next day, newspapers across the country ran headlines like "The Queen's Quiet Rebuke" and "A Christmas Message for Our Times." But more importantly, people talked. Families discussed it over dinner. Friends messaged each other clips of that part of the speech. It wasn't political. It wasn't loud. It was simply human, and that's why it stuck. Back at the barracks, the sergeant finally framed the little girl's drawing. He hung it in his small room, next to his medals and the Queen's letter. It wasn't about glory. It was about reminder of why he served, and who he served for. Years later, long after the Queen was gone, palace staff would recall that she kept a single file in her private study labeled only with a date, the day of the slap. Inside were the security footage stills, the court documents, and a copy of the sergeant's service record. No notes, no commentary, just the facts. As if she wanted to remember not the outrage, but the response, the quiet dignity that rose to meet it. The sergeant himself would go on to train new recruits, teaching them not just how to march or stand at attention, but how to carry themselves when tested. The uniform, he'd tell them, isn't just fabric. It's a promise. And sometimes keeping that promise means doing nothing at all except standing tall. As for the biker, he served his time. When he was released, he disappeared from public view. Some said he moved far away. Others claimed he'd apologized quietly to a veterans group, though no one confirmed it. Whatever became of him, his name faded. But the lesson of what he'd done and what it had sparked did not, because in the end, the story wasn't really about him. It was about the guard who didn't flinch. It was about the Queen who saw everything and chose to act with quiet resolve. It was about the teachers, the students, the strangers who stood in silent solidarity. It was about the idea that even in a world full of noise and anger, there's still power in restraint, in honor, in simply doing what's right, without needing applause. And on certain spring afternoons, when the sun hits the palace gates just right, you can still see the guards standing perfectly still, red coats bright against the stone, bearskin hats casting long shadows. Tourists take photos. Children wave. And if you watch closely, you might notice how the newest recruits stand just a little straighter when they pass the spot where it all happened. Not out of fear, but out of respect. Because some moments change more than just a day. They change how we see each other. And sometimes, all it takes is one person choosing not to strike back, to remind us all what it means to truly stand for something. The story should have ended with part 5. There were only ever meant to be 5 parts. Beginning, tension, reckoning, justice, and legacy. But life, as it often does, kept going. And sometimes the quietest ripples from a single moment travel farther than anyone expects. A year after the incident, something small but meaningful began to happen. Not in headlines or courtrooms, but in towns and cities across the country. Local youth groups, schools, and even scout troops started organizing stillness walks, not marches, not protests, but quiet gatherings where young people would stand together in public spaces for 10 minutes of respectful silence. They didn't carry signs. They didn't chant. They just stood, still and calm, to honor the idea that dignity doesn't need noise to be powerful. The movement had no official leader. It spread through word of mouth, social media posts, and classroom discussions. Teachers reported that students who once mocked being too serious now spoke about self-control with newfound respect. At one such gathering in Manchester, a retired schoolteacher watched from a bench as a group of teenagers stood silently near the town hall. She turned to her friend and said, "I never thought I'd see kids choose stillness over shouting, but maybe they're tired of all the noise." Her friend nodded. Maybe they're learning that real strength doesn't always make a sound. Back in London, the sergeant had settled into his new role with the Queen's personal guard. He rarely spoke about the slap anymore. When asked, he'd simply say, "That day taught me what I already knew. That service means more than pride." But his presence spoke volumes. New recruits watched how he moved, calm under pressure, polite even when tired, always aware of the weight his uniform carried. He became less a symbol and more a steady example, the kind of person others quietly tried to emulate. One rainy afternoon, he was assigned to stand near a side entrance while the Queen met with a group of community leaders. As the meeting ended, one of the visitors, a young woman who ran a youth center in South London, paused as she passed him. She didn't say anything, just gave him a small knowing smile and a slight nod. He returned it, barely perceptible but enough. Later, he learned she'd been at the palace that day to talk about expanding anti-racism programs in schools. Programs inspired, in part by what had happened outside the gates. The Queen, too, continued to carry the memory in her own quiet way. She never mentioned the incident publicly again, but those close to her noticed subtle changes. She began inviting more young service members, especially those from diverse backgrounds, to private audiences. She asked about their experiences, their challenges, their hopes. It wasn't performative. It was personal, and it sent a message: you belong here. Your service matters. Then came a quiet announcement from the Ministry of Defense. A new training module would be added to basic training for all new recruits in the Household Division. It wasn't about combat or marching. It was called Dignity Under Pressure. The module included real-world scenarios, discussions on bias, and, yes, the footage from that spring day. Not to shame, but to teach. Your greatest weapon, the instructors would say, isn't your rifle, it's your character. Meanwhile, the sergeant received a letter from a boy in Leeds. The boy wrote that he'd been bullied at school for being different, and that after seeing the video of the guard standing still, he decided not to fight back. I stood tall like you, he wrote, and my teacher noticed. She talked to the bullies. Things got better. The sergeant read the letter 3 times. Then he wrote back, not as a soldier, but as someone who understood what it cost to choose peace when anger felt easier. Years passed. The Queen grew older. The sergeant earned more stripes, took on more responsibility, and the world kept changing, sometimes for the better, sometimes not. But the lesson of that day never faded. It became part of the unspoken culture of the Guards, a shared understanding that their stillness wasn't weakness. It was strength in its purest form. When the Queen passed, the nation mourned. Crowds gathered outside the palace, not shouting, not demanding, but standing in silence, many with heads bowed, others with hands over hearts. Among the guards lining the procession route was the sergeant, now a warrant officer. His face was calm, his posture perfect, but those who knew him saw the grief in his eyes. He'd stood watch for her many times. Now he stood for her one last time. After the funeral, an old palace aide approached him. She spoke of you once, the aide said quietly. Not often, but when she did, it was with deep respect. She said you reminded her why the crown endures, not because of crowns or thrones, but because of people like you who uphold it with quiet honor. The warrant officer didn't reply. He just nodded, his throat tight. In the years that followed, the story of the slap became less about the violence and more about what rose to meet it. Historians included it in books about modern British values. Documentaries featured interviews with bystanders, teachers, even former bikers who'd left hate behind. But the most powerful moments were the ones no camera caught. A father telling his son, "Be like that guard," as they watched the changing of the guard. A teacher using the story to calm a classroom argument. A veteran placing a poppy at the palace gates on Remembrance Day, whispering, "We see you," and every spring, on the anniversary of that day, a single red rose would appear near the spot where the guard had stood. No note, no name. Just a flower left by someone who remembered. The warrant officer eventually retired. He didn't give grand speeches or write memoirs. He moved to a small village, taught history at a local school, and volunteered with youth groups. When asked about his time in the Guards, he'd smile and say, "I was just doing my job." But the kids he worked with knew better. They saw the way he listened, the way he stayed calm when others lost their temper, the way he treated everyone, no matter their background, with the same quiet respect. One evening, as he walked home from the school, a young boy ran up to him holding a drawing. It showed a figure in a red coat, standing tall under a bright sun. At the bottom, in careful handwriting, it read, "Thank you for showing us how to be brave." The old soldier took the drawing gently. "You keep being brave too," he said. "That's how it keeps going." And so it did. not through monuments or headlines, but through small choices, quiet acts, and the steady passing of values from one generation to the next. Because the real legacy of that day wasn't in the punishment of one man, or even the honor given to another. It was in the countless ordinary people who, after seeing what stillness could do, decided to stand a little taller themselves. In the end, the slap had been loud, but the silence that followed, that was what changed everything.